Thank you very much, Mark, and thank you for inviting me back. On this day of all days, it's a real honour to be in the Joyce Centre, and I thought I'd talk a bit about the idea of epiphany in the course of the chat, and then maybe we could have some debate and questions after. I think if Joyce was granted a 24-year reprieve, a 24-hour reprieve from death, and allowed walk the streets of Dublin today, he would be delighted by some things: the better fed faces and bodies of the children in the streets. He'd be worried by the fact that there are still so many unemployed young people and homeless young people, as there were in the Dubliners he depicted. But he'd be utterly mystified by one thing, which is the number of statues commemorating him all over the place. Because this was the man who said, after all, he got someone to say in his play Exiles, that in my day there were only two kinds of statues in Dublin. The one holding out an arm saying, in my day the dunghill was this high, and the other one looking down imploringly and saying, for God's sake, how do I get down out of here? Joyce didn't, I think, want to be treated as an icon or a sacred statue entity. We know the famous story, possibly about Scott Fitzgerald, but certainly about some young American writer who goes up to Joyce in a hotel in Paris and says, may I kiss the hand that wrote Ulysses? And Joyce says no, because that hand has done a lot of other things as well. Now, I think part of the greatness of Joyce is the way he evoked the sights and smells and sounds of this city. Dollymount Strand, Healy Stationers, the DBC cake shops, everything. And the interesting thing is that 100 years ago, a lot of people thought these were unfit subjects for literature, that they weren't dignified enough to enter great work of art. And they were very shocked to hear all these local names mentioned. And Joyce was quite convinced that his putative publisher, George Roberts, didn't like it either. And he wrote an amazing piece of doggerel, imagining Roberts's unease with the book that did this. Shite and onions, do you think I'll print the name of the Wellington Monument? Sydney Parade and Sandymount Tram, Downes's Cake Shop and Williams's Jam. I'm damned if I do, I'm damned to blazes. Talk about Irish names of places. It's a wonder to me upon my soul, he forgot to mention Curly's Hole. Who was it said, resist not evil? I'll burn that book, so help me devil. I'll penance do with farts and groans, kneeling upon my marrow bones. This very next Lent I will unbear my penitent buttocks to the air, and sobbing beside my printing press, my awful sin I will confess. My Irish foreman from Bannockburn shall dip his right hand in the urn and sign crisscross with reverent thumb, memento homo, upon my bum. I suppose that in some ways the first readers of these stories got the same shock of recognition that my generation did when they saw the dart in the Commitments movie, and suddenly realised that even the contemporary world we lived in could be rendered rapidly into works of art. Now, the man who wrote those lines I just quoted, if he came back for 24 hours, I think would be baffled by one other thing, and that is the failure of so many literary artists in modern and contemporary Ireland to deal in their works with the contemporary setting in the way that Joyce serenely dealt with his. Joyce would recognise the great genius in, say, a book like Amongst Women by John McGahern, or Reading in the Dark by Seamus Dean, or The Dancers Dancing by Eilish Nagivna. But he would also wonder why so many of the great literary works are set 2, 3, 4 generations before the time of writing. He was immersed in the immediate when he wrote Dubliners. And I think in the same way, if say Joyce had the misfortune of opening the Irish Times, which he sometimes called the Squirish Mimes, in the last few days, he would have been amazed at how much of the newspapers are obsessed with 30 years ago. Not just because of the publication of embargoed government papers from the much earlier period, but the way in which even contemporary debates still obsess about things that happened really a long, long time ago. I think along with his mockery of statues went in Joyce's mind a critique of commemoration. he would probably be a little bit sardonic about what I'm and you're doing now. I mean, if you think about one of the themes in The Dead is, of course, laughing at people who think all the great singers are dead and come from the past, and that there couldn't be a great singer now. And you remember when Bloom walks, when he's in the Sirens chapter in the hotel, listening to all the patriotic ballads, he suddenly asks himself, who fears to speak of 1904? And he's asking that in 1904. And when you think that Joyce was, about 16 when the commemoration of 1798, the centenary, happened in Dublin, you can see how allergic in one way he was to commemorations. He probably would have agreed with Conor Cruise O'Brien's much later motto that we Irish are in danger of commemorating ourselves to death. Now, when you think that Conor Cruise O'Brien's mother was actually based on Miss Ivors, the Sheehy girl in The Dead, and imagine what would have happened if Joyce had got off with her, and the kind of anti-commemorative revisionist would have been produced from that marriage. Maybe it's just as well it didn't happen. But I'm sure Joyce would be delighted also to think that we're still talking so passionately about his books, and even to know that today an app has been produced by UCD around that story called The Dead, because he was, of course, a keen user of all modern technology. But I think he'd also ask the question I've asked about Irish writers now: to what extent have they interrogated and excavated their own present as he did his? Now, in the century since Dubliners, there have been some terrific short story collections. If you think of O'Flaherty's great book in Irish, Duel, or McGahern's High Ground, which came out in the mid-1980s, or even quite recently, Claire Keegan's Walk the Blue Fields. These are collections you could put beside Dubliners and the authors would not be made to blush. And in the same way, there's individual great stories like McGahern's Country Funeral, or Claire Keegan's beautiful short story, Foster, that you could easily put in an anthology alongside The Dead, and they would not look too vulnerable either. But I don't think any of the anthologies has achieved the sustained brilliance of Dubliners as a collection, nor any of the stories has quite equalled the one called The Dead. And to me, the really astonishing thing about The Dead is that it was produced by a young man still in his 20s, who was actually making a god-awful mess, often, of his own private life. Well, I mean, when you read The Dead or even look at the Houston movie, there's just so much wisdom about human nature in it, so much understanding of the Irish character and personality. How could someone who was living in such disorder know so much at the same time? And I mean, maybe it's just a sign that great artists are media for forces that are much more powerful than any one person can be. The point I wanted to make tonight was this. I think in Joyce's time, the short story was often seen as a junior form, the kind of finger exercise done by a young apprentice before he or she went on to write the great novel. And this remained the dominant view, I think, through the 20th century, particularly here in Ireland, where people excelled at the short story. And you got a kind of theory of the form developed in some brilliant works of criticism by people like Frank O'Connor in The Lonely Voice, and then by Sean O'Faolain in his book called The Short Story. And the argument basically was, as O'Connor put it, that the short story was the form suited to the lonely voice of marginal people in a society still unmade, a society still freeing itself, but that the novel dealt with the multiple layers of social classes of a fully made society. And therefore the novel, and O'Faolain said this again and again, was a sign of the normal. It was the expression of a fully achieved, fully floated society, adequate to its plenitude. Now, I think, for all their greatness, both of these books by O'Connor and O'Faolain, and more generally, the fetishizing of the Irish short story, did a great disservice, above all, to the short story itself as a form, not least to the ones produced by O'Connor and O'Faolain themselves. But they had the effect also of making Dubliners appear as apprentice work. The awesome subsequent achievement of Portrait of the Artist, Ulysses, and Finnegan's Wake meant that Dubliners was often read, too often, as a rehearsal, a prelude, a sign of great early promise. And actually, even the genius, William Butler Yeats, whom Joyce used to call Wonder Willie the Werewalker, even W.B. Yeats essentialized this idea almost as soon as he read the stories in Dubliners, because he said they contained the promise of a novelist of a new kind. So he was reading it as the prelude by Joyce. And subsequent critics, even very gifted ones, persisted in viewing the later masterpieces as experimental novels, which somehow extended the scope of the genre called a novel, which we're still trying to, in ways we're still trying to understand. I've always argued, from the time I wrote the intro to the Penguin Ulysses in 1991, that these books are not novels at all. Portrait, Ulysses, The Wake. They seem to me, as is Dubliners, forms of emergency, of an emergent form that is still not named. And even a century after, we still cannot find a generic name for the form the book is written in. The way we can confidently say that, Great Expectations is a novel or The Odyssey is an epic, because the form is still emergent. Now, Joyce always viewed his works as part of a continuum. He didn't really distinguish between Dubliners and what came later. He said famously, to read any of my work, you have to read all of it. This was, of course, a confident declaration by a true graduate of Belvedere College up the road. Belvedere boys have one gift, which is they do not doubt themselves as the scrum moves forward. And Joyce used the Feast of the Epiphany as the setting for the climactic story of Dubliners. And there is indeed, in that great story, a sudden manifestation of something like supernatural power, in the course of which more can be suggested than can be known, and more can be felt, as I said, than can be analysed. But I think the truncated epiphanies of all the earlier stories in Dubliners are actually developed further in many of the later works, which often loop the techniques and the texts of Dubliners for similar epiphanies. If you think of Stephen's parable of the plums in Ulysses, it's definitely something that could have easily appeared as a story in Dubliners. And even the account of Stephen's inconclusive meeting with Bloom at the end, which peters out into a ... is just like the petering out into a ... of so many climactic moments in the Dubliners' tales. I think there was a bit of a tragedy in criticism of Joyce in the mid-20th century, which was that generic definitions congealed around books like Portrait, which was described as a roman fleuve, or Ulysses as a stream of consciousness novel, so described, or The Wake as a dream novel. And yet I think some astute readers, early readers of Joyce, understood that his project was actually the reverse, to achieve a line of escape from these traditional ideas of genre, to avoid the constraints of writing a novel, a short story, or whatever. There's a great little book by a man called Harry Levin, which is one of the first books on Joyce and still one of the greatest. And he says in it, all of Joyce's work was an ongoing epic, whose true hero was the English language. But even Levin didn't allow himself to notice, for instance, that individual stories in Dubliners often seem like micro-parodies of some of the great classic novels of Europe. For instance, The Two Gallants are obviously down-market versions of Don Quixote and Sancho Panza, which is the beginning of the modern novel, Don Quixote. Or poor Mrs. Sinico, who is killed by a tram she manages to fall under, is a Sydney Parade version of Tolstoy's Anna Karenina. And I think of these stories as deliberately, in their microness, engaging with the macroness of these great long novels. And in fact, on the subject of big and little, everybody knows that Ulysses, in a way, began as a possible Dubliner short story, Mr. Hunter's Day, which just exfoliated, and, as Alice would say, got curiouser and curiouser. Each of the stories in Dubliners, when you think about them, chronicles a kind of abortive attempt at freedom by desperate characters who want more. But I think each of the characters is a kind of equivalent version of James Joyce and his dream of expressive freedom as a writer. And of course, the attempt is usually thwarted. The impulse becomes self-negating. I mean, when the boys go mitching in an encounter, they have to engage in so much organisation just, to play hooky for the day, that, as Clive Hart once said, the gesture of defiance cannot be seen as such. They have to pretend to be conformists even as they're rebelling. I think in the same way, Joyce wanted to rebel against the constraints of both the short story as a form and the novel as a form. He used Homer's scaffolding, but behind it he wanted to produce something that was very new, quite without precedent. And in that way, Joyce is very like many of the characters in Dubliners, who keenly feel their own humiliation, the humiliation of their situation, and also a sense of their own outraged dignity and lost potential, that they're made for a much better fate than the one they know. I mean, in one way, the characters, so many of the characters in Dubliners, say Mr. Duffy, but you could mention any of them, they don't want to be caught in the mechanisms of a kind of Maupassant provincial novel about quiet desperation on the margins. But equally, they don't want to be prisoners in a Euro novel of Tolstoy or, Cervantes' proportions. Joyce actually said when he finished writing each of the stories in Dubliners Before the Dead that he was rewarded by no sense of difficulty overcome. And yet every critic who's read the book has seen the way the stories are bound together by themes and recurring symbols and characters. And quite a few of the characters, of course, turn up again, as we know, in Ulysses. But the collection called Dubliners isn't just a collection of separate stories, nor is it what you would call a novel. Each story moves to a kind of revelation in the epiphany of an impasse, a paralysis that marks the termination. But that's also true of the multifaceted assemblage that would be Ulysses. And actually, I think this is part of the radicalism of Irish writing more generally. European writers, inverted commas, believed in growth, in what we call the developmental model that Europe tried to export colonially to all other parts of the world. But the Irish, who had been through the famine, and many famines before the Great Famine, could not buy into this teleology, this idea of a narrative going somewhere special. And you find it in Carleton and in Edgeworth, as you find it in Joyce and later in Beckett, that the idea of build-up, of growth, of learning from experience is challenged in these very radical narratives, which, whatever their length, are not really conventional novels at all, but works of shreds and patches, assembled to no clear overall purpose, other than the revelation of this fragmentation to its victims and its exponents. There's a great little book by Felix Deleuze and Guattari about Kafka, who I think was a very similar writer of stories to Joyce. And they say, never has so complete an oeuvre been made from movements that are always aborted, yet always in communication with each other. Never has so complete an oeuvre been made from these aborted movements. And I want to quote Gilbert and Sullivan, what, never? No, never? Well, hardly ever. Because I would argue they're basically right about Kafka, but this is also true of Joyce and many of the classic Irish authors. You all know, and I'm sure you've been talking through the weekend about this, that Joyce said in Dubliners he offered his own people a look at themselves in his nicely polished looking glass. Actually, as far back as 1834, Maria Edgeworth had said that to show the people themselves in a mirror in Ireland would be a very, very dangerous thing to do. She said that Irish readers would smash the glass and curse the artist who had constructed it. And of course, that kind of rage would be pointless, as Joyce saw, because if people smash the mirror, what are they left with? The cracked looking glass of a servant, the symbol of Irish art. So that the gesture of revolt, like when the young boys mitch from school, doesn't really liberate, it just deepens the whole crisis of representation. Now, there's a great essay by Salman Rushdie where he picks up on the point made by Joyce and Maria Edgeworth in his book of essays, Imaginary Homelands. It's the keynote sentence in the book. He says, "The exiled writer is obliged always to deal in broken mirrors, some of whose fragments have been irretrievably lost." Now some, not all. Because, yes, for Joyce, the writing of Dubliners was, as everyone sort of agrees, a statement of why he went into exile, a measure of his own exile from Ireland. Writing was a metaphor for going into exile from the world, as is reading when we get lost in the book. But also he was dealing with Ireland's exile from its own past. And he wasn't the first Irish author to face this realization. For all its newness, I think Dubliners is admirably indebted to some great predecessors. And most of all, it's indebted to the one who is never credited or cited, Maria Edgeworth. Because both she and Joyce are committed to the same thing, to documenting the decline of a community. She does it through the decline of the Rackrent family over 4 or 5 generations. But they both draw evidence of public decline from private examples. And they prefer to tell the story through the personal rather than the public world. And they both share a deep understanding of the ways in which individuals bear always the stigmata, the marks of social forces. So I would say Joyce may have perfected the epiphany, but he wasn't the inventor of it. In fact, I think if anyone invented it in the literary tradition, that was probably Maria Edgeworth. There's an interesting sentence in Stanislaus Joyce's book, My Brother's Keeper, where he says that the epiphany, and particularly he's saying the stories in Dubliners as they come to a climactic revelation, the epiphany is built around gestures, I quote, by which people betrayed the very things they were most anxious to conceal. But this is straight out of the preface by Edgeworth to Castle Rackrent. She says, "It is from men's careless compositions, their half-finished sentences, that we may hope with the greatest possibility of success to discover their real characters." Their throwaway lines, she says, they're half-finished sentences. Sure, every second story in Dubliners is about an unfinished sentence. And we know why. Because the guy who wrote them had been working as a teacher of English as a foreign language in Italy. And if you teach as a language as a foreign language anywhere, all you hear all day from your students are half-finished sentences. So no wonder Joyce became the master of the unfinished sentence, ultimately in the meeting of Stephen and Bloom. But it's interesting that Maria Edgeworth foresaw this and saw this as having epiphanic importance, revelatory importance. But I also think she was part of a deeper Irish tradition, which I've already been hinting at, which actually goes back to Gulliver's Travels by Swift, in which you get, think of the Travels, a collection of 4 micro-anecdotes presented with great gusto and wit, only to be called 100 years later, and this is our theme tonight, 100 years on, only to be called a novel subsequently by librarians, shopkeepers, etc. And this despite the fact that Gulliver learns absolutely nothing from any of his 4 adventures, which is normally what the protagonist of a novel is expected to do, to learn a little in the Bildung from the experience. The same thing is true in Castle Rackrent. You go through the phases of the different generations and they seem to learn nothing as the family declines. It too is a mockery in some ways of the developmental idea then being perfected elsewhere in the European novels, and then interspersed with philosophical musing. Craine Killer, the greatest book in modern Irish, the same thing. And yet they're all filed in libraries as experimental novels, and yet not one of them is no more than Ulysses, which is caught in the interstices between novel and story. Now, what I'm saying is this: don't just give it 100 years, give it 300 or 400, and we will have a name for the genre that Dubliners and Ulysses and At Swim Two Birds and Gulliver's Travels and Castle Rackrent and Craine Killer are all written in. By then we surely will be able to give a stabilised definition of what these different kind of assemblages mean and are. And when we do, the Dubliners will be a central exhibit in the evolution of this form. Because Dubliners perfectly captures the in-between state of living in this place, a conurbation that was neither fully country nor city, but some strange blend of the two. I remember, in fact, reading once in one of the stories in McGahern's High Ground, a teacher walking up Grafton Street and he sees dandelion clocks floating over Switzer's roof, and he remembers there's brambles and a field behind Switzer's, and he thinks to himself, Jesus, this place will never be a city. But it's not countryside either. It's something weirdly in between in the way that Joyce's stories are. And I've often made the point about the stories in Dubliners that just as Dublin is really a collection of kind of rural villages that got joined up and made to look a bit like a city, Dubliners is a collection of micro anecdotes that looks vaguely like a novel, but ultimately isn't. But in the meantime, in the intervening 200 years still to come, we should glory in the undefinability of each of these texts, because they emerge when a society is in meltdown. One order is replaced by another before the stable new genre takes over. And in other parts of Europe, this happened over just 4 or 5 decades, when the feudal order made way for the bourgeoisie, and the world of epic was replaced by the bourgeois world, the middle class world of the domesticated novel form. But the texts I've been mentioning were written by Irish authors at, when Ireland was going through a much slower motion change, which even still hasn't fully concluded. We almost invented a middle class in the years of the tiger, but then it didn't happen. And we are back to the in-between narrative. In other countries, the idea of freedom soon congealed into the idea of, the right of the middle class to consume, to have privilege, and form declined into formula. But the astonishing rawness and beauty of the texts I've mentioned stands as a judgment over the social forces that gave rise to them. Now, this is all a bit speculative, but I could give you examples in semi-proof of it. A couple of years ago, Frank McGuinness turned The Dead into a very entertaining play in the Abbey. And a couple of decades earlier, John Huston made The Dead into a brilliant movie. And most movies are woeful misrepresentations of the prior text, but I don't think Huston's was. In many ways, it met the greatness of its source. I think The Dead could survive all these translations into other forms because of its open intergeneric nature, because its elements, which you might call fragmentary scenes, sometimes tragic, sometimes comic, but fragmentary, they had not been fully subordinated to the idea that it was either a story or a novel. We normally escape this by saying it's a long, short story, the way we say about Claire Keegan's Foster, which is published separately as a book, but is neither. And this is because every really great work of art unsettles the generic categories and enjoys a blessed period of freedom in its own individuality before people start the awful parlour game of labelling. It's what Walter Benjamin meant when he made his wonderful statement that really original works of art destroy one genre in the act of also helping to create another. And what he actually said was even more subtle. He said, I quote directly, "A major work will either establish a genre or abolish it, and the perfect work will do both." Now, I think that's exactly what Joyce's books did. It's a great pity we don't have an extensive commentary by Walter Benjamin on James Joyce, because it would be well worth reading. And I think he would have seen in the Epiphany an example of what Benjamin called profane illumination, a moment when something seemingly casual acquires a kind of deeper transcendent meaning. And this often happens in Dubliners, say when a coin is passed. When Corley, for instance, extracts a coin from a serving girl. You remember that moment when you read about Gabriel in The Dead thrusting a coin at Lily, the caretaker's daughter, and you know that both men are being selfish and manipulative, and that a coin in Western culture is meant to symbolize the difference between, if you like, material fact and abstract value. And Joyce has tapped into this great tradition in making the image of the passed coin recur until it becomes epiphanic or symbolic within the telling of the story. In a way, the passing of a coin has no prior meaning. It is charged with retroactive significance by the fact that it recurs later in the book. So that it's really only when the stories in Dubliners are read against each other that we can link Corley and Gabriel in their exploitative attitude to young women. And it's only when we complete a reading of the book that we can make full sense of symbolic gestures as if for the first time. In other words, it's as if these stories can't be read without being reread. And as Joyce would say, to read any of them, you have to read all of them. And he was right. Now, I thought I would make some comments, obviously, on this day of all days about the dead, but I would just preface them with a few comments about some of the earlier material, maybe the first story in the book. I think there's Joyce is one of the great recorders of Irish childhood and what it's like, and particularly the first three stories in Dubliners, which concern a young narrator who's given no name, and seems in many ways to feel his own lack of identity very, very severely. When you think of the term epiphany, it has a religious context. It's like moral history, a phrase Joyce used to describe his book. And the point in the opening story, The Sisters, is that the church has abdicated its authority. The gap left by the dead priest has to be filled by the artist, Joyce, and the futile religion represented by the priest's broken chalice must be substituted by some superior form of authority. When the priest dies, the boy feels what he calls relief, because the priesthood embodied a maleficent and sinful being. Joyce tells us then, after the priest dies, the drabness remains, and this is obvious in the ... the uncle's empty cliches, Cotter's unfinished sentences. And yet Joyce won't tell you what he thinks. He's an artist, he just records. And there's very little about which the reader can be sure. The boy who tells it is so young and guileless, he doesn't say what the priest suffered from. We're told by one of the adults he was just too scrupulous always. And everyone is divided in their responses. They retreat into the good old Dublin phrase, "We done all we could for him, poor as we are." And techniques are used to heighten the sense of doubt. The boy says, "I puzzled my head to extract meaning from Cotter's unfinished sentences." And then the boy thinks, maybe I'll get clarification in my dream. But the very dream he has, like most of our dreams, is unfinished. And that is all we get told as his own sentences trail off in midstream. Language, even in the hands of a master like Joyce, is shown as in some way inadequate to render the depth of the experience. The epiphany exists, as everyone agrees, but it exists not for the boy, only for the reader. And yet we learn a great deal that the boy may not be able to frame, because of course we are being asked to frame everything in the book. The third story repeats some of these images, the idea of the chalice, the idea of religion, and the romantic quest for religious fulfillment. So that, as most readers agree, you carry the insights of one story into your reading of the next. But I've no doubt, I argued in my book on Ulysses that Joyce was trying to produce an alternative spirituality to the one he felt betrayed by in institutional Irish Catholicism. This is obvious in the stories through the book. Just briefly to comment on an encounter, the second story. The boys in it are playing with the Dillon brothers. All our bouts ended with Joe Dillon's war dance of victory. His parents went to 8 o'clock Mass every morning in Gardner Street, as if there's some connection between their victory at fighting and the piety of the parents going to Mass every day in Gardner Street. And of course the anti-clerical, even anti-Jesuit irony is maintained by another juxtaposition later in the paragraph, because in the game Joe Dillon always shouts the same phrase, "Ya, yaka, yaka, yaka." So we're told everyone was incredulous when it was reported he had a vocation for the priesthood. Talk about anti-clerical subversion. I think if Pope Francis really does want to take on the Curia and bureaucratic Catholicism, this could be one of the key texts as a wily Jesuit he would employ, and he could quote maybe the the most gifted of all graduates of the Jesuit fathers. But I mean, the point that most people rightly make about the stories in this book is the characters can feel a sense of humiliation. The boy at the end of the encounter has had an interesting encounter with the old josser, but he needs to be rescued by the more robust Mahony, who is, quote unquote, only a Christian Brothers boy. And he feels his own powerlessness, even the narrating boy, even as he feels his own superior sensitivity. But in none of these stories that follow, until the dead really, with the possible exception of a painful case, do any of the protagonists manage to experience the epiphany of their own powerlessness. This is in a way reserved for the famous paragraphs about Gabriel Conroy at the very end. But I've always found it fascinating that Gabriel might be the grown-up version of the boy in The Sisters and An Encounter. The boy who looked down his nose at Mahony, the Christian Brothers' robust playmate, the boy who went to national school rather than a private prep school. And the same aloofness is in Gabriel, and he won't admit initially that his wife comes from the West. She's from the West, her people are. It's a great phrase. And the incredibly snobbish names given to Gabriel and his brother Constantine by this mother who dressed him in sailor suits, which was the very imperial clothing denounced by Arthur Griffith in his journalism. Arthur Griffith, the leader of Sinn Féin, whom Joyce so much admired. And this is behind Miss Ivors, the future Miss Conor Cruise O'Brien, or Miss Frances Cruise O'Brien, calling Gabriel a West Briton, because just like young Joyce, he reviews books for the Dublin Daily Express, and she says you should go on your holidays to Arran rather than the continent. And she is just one of a whole sequence of women who punctures Gabriel's self-esteem. It begins with his unsatisfactory exchange with Lily, the servant girl, when he thrusts the coin at her, but then discovers she's been done schooling for more than a year, and he didn't bloody well bother to know. And then his after-dinner speech about the ants is completely subverted by his private notion that they're just two ignorant old women. So he's exposed as a self-absorbed phony, one of the living dead in Dublin. And the escapes from Dublin to holidays on continental Europe. And remember what I said about Joyce's reservations about the European developmental model. I think this is a story that implements them. And the escape there by Gabriel is no more successful than the attempted escape by the boys in An Encounter, who just end up in a place called Rings End by the pigeon house, where now apparently they are shooting the pigeons in order to get dinners to survive it all. And it's really about every Dubliner carrying their paralysis with them, this whole book. It's interesting in a way that the choice is between Arran and the continent. Suddenly England has become a bore. Nobody wants to be the province of a province. And to that extent, Joyce's story is part of the literature of the Irish revival. But I think the treatment of Miss Ivors is a lot less satiric than some people say. She gets her vitality from Arran, from the West, and she walks away from the party and refuses to dine, because all the talk is about the great singers being the dead ones, and she is thinking more about the future. And of course she comes from that very place which Greta comes from, which will give the lyric significance to the late passages of the story. Mr. Darcy is Gabriel's only real antagonist, and it's his song, The Lass of Aughrim, that transports Greta into silent reverie. And the distance, in a way, that Gabriel feels from his wife is brilliantly captured when Joyce says he's looking at Greta, looking off stage at Mr. Darcy. Distant music he would call the picture if he were a painter. The whole technique of the story is to break down that objectifying of his wife and his own self-absorption. But the scene on the stairway is a kind of symbol of the unsatisfactory marriage of the Conroys, because it shows Greta's yearnings for another man who's not in vision. She is thinking, as Darcy sings about the Lass of Aughrim and the Lord letting her in, but she's thinking of the dead Michael Fury, And Gabriel seems to know so little about this. It makes you wonder what kind of a psychology the whole marriage was based on. And then suddenly, Darcy's singing stops. It's just like the sentences that don't end all through the book. Just like Gabriel's friendly impulse to Lily is defeated. And when they're walking home, Greta says to a night watchman, "Is the fire hot, sir?" But there's no reply. Each attempt, even the attempt by Darcy to sing, is abortive. And even Gabriel's story about the horse going around King Billy's statue, which of course increases the identification of his family with the occupying British power, but it is in the end, like the word ring's end, an image of hopeless circularity. And I come back to what I began with, statues, because the horse walks around the statue of King Billy in an image of repetition and kind of futility. But Gabriel also goes past the statue of Dan O'Connell. He gives a jocular salute as he passes. And I've always thought, when I've read Joyce's satirical comments on statues, and this is why I'm serious in saying I don't think he would like to be a statue. If you really read this story, it's like what Aristotle says about the comic clown. The comic clown, Aristotle says, is static, like a statue. He stands still and goes on revealing himself. So the statue of O'Connell in the story is covered in snow. O'Connell is dead, but so is the living Gabriel covered in snow on his overcoat. And the fellow feeling with the statue is literally a dead giveaway. In my day, the dunghill was so high. I've always thought the best reading of this story was given by Ellman in the great biography. That the snow is cold, and against it the party asserts an image of warm human fellowship. But Gabriel feels the warmth is stifling, and he wants to get with his wife back into the snow to go back to the hotel where they might make love. And when they're climbing the stairs, the electric light fails, like the current of the marriage's emotion, and she rebuffs her husband and recalls the dead Michael. And the candle is offered and refused. It's an amazing moment. Plays off the moment at the end of late in Ulysses, when the Paschal candle is lit, and suddenly, out of the depressive Irish darkness, the room gets illuminated. Newgrange on the 21st, etc. And this is what happens here. Gabriel is suddenly saved. Generous tears fill his eyes. He learns to feel for people outside himself. And the meaning of the snow, and this is what Ellman said, changes from an image of isolation to one of mutual fellowship, so that the dead O'Connell is bound through the snow to the living Gabriel, like the dead Galway youth to the live woman he loved. And the snow falls like the descent of their last end on all the living and the dead. When Joyce was an undergraduate at UCD, his favourite motto was, according to Stanislaus, "Death is the highest form of life." And that seems to be the burden of the story, that the boy in the opening story was spooked by the corpse of the priest. He could look at death, but he couldn't look through it. Yeats said that you only begin to live when you conceive of life as a tragedy. And I think that's what's happening to Gabriel in those famous final passages. He's not just looking at death. Maybe for the first time in his life, he's looking through death. Thanks very much.